What's happening, Hardscapers? Today we're going to be talking about different pricing methodologies. This is for you contractors out there. Let's get into this. So today we're going to go through 4 different pricing methodologies. The one that I use, especially the one that's incorporated into our How to Hardscape headquarters software. Link is in the description below if you want to learn more about that. But we're going to be getting into factoring, square foot pricing, mores, and labor rate to recover your overhead. Now, overhead is a business killer. It is the things that come out of your bank account to pay for things like equipment, tools, and other business expenses that don't get tied to a specific project. And if you're not recovering these things, they are going to slowly kill your business. So you need to incorporate a percentage of these overhead expenses into every project that you're quoting. We're going to show you how to recover that overhead in these 4 different pricing methodologies. So let's get started with factoring. And factoring is just a markup essentially that we add to some sort of factor in our proposal. Usually this is some sort of materials times a multiple, or it's materials plus labor multiplied by something, and that is our factor. Whatever that something is our multiple. So I'm just going to change colors here, and we're just going to assume it's 2 because this is a common one that we get. And 2 assumes that your material plus your labor, if you deduct that by your revenue, that's your gross profit on that project. So revenue minus cost of goods is your gross profit. So a lot of people say multiply it by 2 and you get a 50% gross profit with this. Now the reason why we don't like this is that materials, I don't like that dictating what our profit is going to be. And here's the reason why. We could have $2.50 per square foot pavers that we install on a project, and these could be those small little 4x8s, extremely cheap, and this could cost us $250 for a 100 square foot patio of some sort, or a landing, just something small, and this would give us then $250 in our gross profit. That's based on this figure here. So when we multiply that by 250 by 2, we get 250 for the material itself and 250 for our gross profit margin. Now, if we step this up and we are going to install those 13 by 13 slabs, so they are maybe double the price at $5 a square foot. And so that $100 or 100 square foot patio is going to be $500 in materials. And this is going to give us $500 now in gross profit for our pavers. And the reason why I don't like this is this 13 by 13, those larger pavers, we're actually going to lay them faster than we would these $2.50 pavers. Yet, even though our labor time is less, we're actually going to make more in our gross profit for this. So we will make less with those 4x8s as opposed to those 13 by 13s, and it'll take us less time. Now you may think to yourself, well, less time, we make more money, this is great. Well, this is where you start to price yourself out of the market for certain things, and it's better to go off of labor time to dictate your gross profit as opposed to those materials dictating our gross profit. And we'll revisit this when we get to multiple overhead recovery system. But for factoring, this is the reason why I don't like factoring. Now the next one we're going to cover is square foot pricing, and this is essentially just taking the square footage of a project and multiplying it by a dollar figure that you deem fit for that square footage. In this case, we're going to just put in the dollar figure of $25 per square foot, and that's going to give us what our total revenue is for that project, or what we're sending to the client as a quote for that project. And the reason why I don't like this is this figure here, this $25 encapsulates so much that it's very difficult to keep this consistent from project to project. And for our projects, everything is custom. And you would essentially need a dollar figure for every single factor that goes into a project, whether it is front yard versus the backyard versus a driveway versus a front walkway versus a patio versus a raised patio. Versus the access that we get into that backyard, if that's a factor as well, and also getting into all the different materials that we can incorporate into each of those projects. For example, like our factoring example, our 4x8s will have a different square footage pricing as opposed to our 13 by 13s. But also, you would then need different multiples for the driveway versus a backyard 4x8s and versus 13 by 13s, and a backyard patio 4x8s versus 13 by 13s. That's you're already getting into so many different dollar amounts that you're creating. And most people that price by the square foot do not change this much from project to project, or from project type to project type, or material type that's getting added versus material type. So unless you have a different dollar amount for all of these different variables, and you get into so many, then you likely are not pricing yourself appropriately. And if you are doing all these different dollar amounts, well, then you might as well just do production rates, because that's essentially what you're getting into with all these different variables. Have production rates, and at least if you have production rates, then you get labor hours. And if you have labor hours, you then have a data point that you can compare. Okay, this project took us this long, but we quoted it for this long, as opposed to a dollar figure that encapsulates materials, labor, your overhead, and your net profit on top of that. And this figure does not show you that broken down step by step, like what is your labor dollar amount for this? What is your material dollar amount for this? What is your overhead dollar amount for this? And what is your net profit dollar amount for this? We don't have these figures, and this dollar amount, this variable, does not give us all of these figures that we want to be able to then, after a project is completed, see where we went right with that project, see where we went wrong, and we can't do that with square footage pricing. And this is why I don't like square footage pricing. Now, what I do like square footage pricing for is for market-based pricing. And why I like it for market-based pricing is because if you know where you are in your market, and you know the market can only bear a certain amount, well, square footage pricing will allow you to just quickly get projects quoted. It won't give you these different variables that we want to be able to see where we went right and where we went wrong. But things like commercial work, you can use market-based pricing for. But for residential work, it's just much more difficult, because you ultimately want to get more than market-based pricing. And where that comes into factor is perceived value. You want to have perceived value within your business that you are giving to your client, and that allows them to make a decision that they'll go with you even though you're a bit higher priced than that lowest price bid. And that's where you make your money with residential contracting. So this is why I do not like square footage pricing. But in terms of giving a market-based price for something, or if you're always doing the exact same project day in and day out, which I'm sure is nobody in this space, then market-based pricing or square footage pricing might be something that you want to figure. If none of these different variables with materials, with labor, ever change from project to project, I'm sure that's nobody, but then you could use square footage pricing, or to give a rough budget range of what it's going to cost your client to help to pre-qualify them when they reach out to you. Only times I will use square footage pricing. Okay, the next one that we're going to cover is multiple overhead recovery system, or this is short form for MORS. And MORS assumes a percentage markup on different variables in your business, such as the labor, the materials, and subcontractors, and each of these get a different percentage amount. So they're not all 25% markup, 25% markup, 25% markup. They'll all have their own percentage points to mark up. Now, if it was single overhead recovery system, so SOARs instead of MORS, then it would all be the same percentage markup. The reason why I like MORS over SOARs is that labor comes with a lot more hand-holding and management than materials do versus what subs do. So each of these percentages get different markups to be able to recoup our overhead. The reason why I like MORS also is its diversification. You're marking up these different variables, you're diversifying, so if one of them lacks, the other kind of picks up the slack a little bit if that happens with your projects. The reason why I don't like MORS though is that I don't like recovering our overhead through materials. And here's the reason why. In addition to what we covered there with factoring, with the 4x8s versus 13x13s and recovering our overhead that way, the reason why I don't like this here is because let's pretend a retaining wall. A retaining wall for our initial layer, that takes us pretty much the same amount of time to level out that initial layer, whether we are doing a $10 face foot wall or a $20 face foot wall. So if it takes the same amount of time, we're actually going to make more money with that $20 a face foot wall as opposed to our $10 a face foot wall. Because if each of these takes us, let's say, 1 hour for every 20 linear feet, we are going to make more money with a markup on our $20 a face foot wall and less for our $10 a face foot wall. And that's where a percentage markup on our materials will not recover the same amount, even though it'll take the same amount of time for each of these different materials. And this is why it gets a lot more complicated with multiple overhead recovery system to be able to recover our overhead through various materials, because we would ultimately need different percentage markups for all these different materials to be able to calculate. And then you're getting into a lot of different calculations. This is why consultants love multiple overhead recovery system, because there's a lot of consultant time to help you figure out these percentages if you don't know how to do it yourself. And another reason why I don't like multiple overhead recovery system is we actually have to make a budget at the beginning of the season and be able to dictate how much materials we're going to be using in that season to come up with a percentage that we're going to mark up our materials to recover that overhead. And there's so many things wrong with this. At least in different years, you may have some sort of consistency, but in years where it gets a little bit more difficult, you might be taking on projects that you don't usually take on, and you may not know that at the beginning of the year. You may be completely off with your material budgeted amount, because you may switch from design build at the beginning of the season, and at some point in time in the season start to take on more drainage work or more lift and relays. All of these come with different percentages of materials to then incorporate into the entire project. For example, a lift and relay may have 10% of the total gross revenue of that project allocated to materials, whereas design and build may be more like 25 to 30%. And if you budgeted that 25 to 30% to recover your overhead, but you start doing more and more lift and relay work, you're out a lot of percentage points between those two different types of projects. If you add services such as lighting, lighting is very material heavy, but also very labor light, as opposed to pavers, which is also labor heavy, but material. Whereas pavers is more material, labor, overhead, very much balanced between those. So there's definitely different profit margins when it comes to different services, and it's difficult to come up with a percentage points for all of those to recover your overhead. And the last one that we're going to cover here is a labor rate. And labor rate assumes a percentage markup on your labor specifically. So we're going to add a percentage markup on our labor, or for me, it's actually a dollar amount that we recover. And the way that we do this is we tie it specifically to our budgeted hours for that season. So if we have 1,000 hours in a season and our overhead we have calculated is 100,000, we know that we need to actually make $100 per hour, which is essentially 100,000 divided by our 1,000 hours that we have, which equals $100 per hour that we're going to have to make back on every project, in addition to our labor, in addition to our materials, and in addition to our net profit. So this is something that gets allocated to our labor, but not covering our total labor. So we still need to add our labor into this total amount. And the reason why I like this is because we can easily be able to budget our labor hours that we have in a season. Especially when we're a smaller company, it's a lot easier to know how much time that we have in a season to recoup our overhead. And it's tied specifically to our schedule, so we can quite easily recover that overhead. We can also set goals in our budget to be able to hit certain milestones, and we can incorporate that in our total overhead to be able to say, in 3 years, I want to have 30,000 saved up to be able to spend it on a down payment for a skid steer. So we're going to get $10,000 every year added into our overhead to meet that goal. So it's a great way to set goals with budgeting, but not that you can't do budgeting with multiple overhead recovery system and other systems like these. But this is the most basic way to be able to recover that overhead through that budgeting system. Now, the reason why I don't like labor rate is that you either have one of two choices: recover this through crews or recover this through each individual person. And if you recover it through each individual person, you likely have times in the season where you have 4 employees, sometimes 3 employees, maybe 5 employees, and it fluctuates through that season depending on how you're able to retain. So you want to find that average and figure out your hours from that. Whereas crews, if you choose crews, you just want to make sure that those crews are fairly consistent. They have 3 people on the crew, they have 3 people on the crew, crew A versus crew B. Keep those consistent to be able to make sure that your overhead recovery is consistent through these. But me, on the other hand, we are working on a labor rate percentage to be able to allocate different percentages for different positions in the company. For example, a foreman versus a laborer. A foreman will have more percentage of overhead allocated to them because they're likely to stay with the company longer, be more productive, whereas a laborer may be just starting out. So we want to allocate a different percentage of our overhead to that laborer because they may come and go as they see fit. They may need more training. They're likely less efficient than our foreman. So there's different percentage points of our overhead recovery that will allocate to a foreman versus a laborer. For example, our foreman, we might allocate 50% of our overhead for that specific project to that foreman and maybe 25% to our laborer. And that's how we create this graduated percentage points to be able to recover our overhead through these different positions, depending on however many positions that we have within the business. And that would get us our 100% for a specific project. So to break this down, if we have a 1-hour project and we need to cover that $100 for that 1-hour project, our foreman would actually recover $50 of that. Our laborer would recover $25 of that, and our other laborer would recover $25 of that. And that's how we really like this graduated percentage for labor rate to recover our overhead. It's something that we're working on implementing into our How to Hardscape headquarters software. Hey, I hope this video's helped you in some way. If you want more information on the How to Hardscape headquarters software, information is going to be in the description below with a link. If you have any questions from this video, leave a comment in the comment section. I'll respond to anybody and everybody. And I do want to know if you want more of these types of videos. We got lots that I can get into when it comes to things like overhead, budgeting, pricing, and so much more when it comes to business topics. So leave your comments in the comment section and any suggestions that you want to learn more about. Like this video if you found it helpful for whatever reason, and subscribe to this YouTube channel for more hardscaping content like this. Thank you so much for watching.